My name is Nina Aldred, and I was 22 years old the night my mother gave a toast at my graduation dinner and used it to publicly rank her daughters. She had reserved the back room of a restaurant she used for client events, white tablecloths, a floral centerpiece, 39 people who all knew her better than they knew me. I had just finished my undergraduate degree in business finance with a 3.87 GPA and a job offer starting the following Monday. My mother stood, lifted her glass, and asked the room to settle down. Nina has always been the daughter who surprised us, she began, and I thought, for one small second, that she meant it as a compliment. She was never the effortless one. She had to work for everything, and honestly, that builds character. She paused. Now, some daughters are born with a light that just fills whatever room they walk into. That's a different kind of gift. Nina was given a different path. She reached out her hand, and my younger sister Viola stepped forward and took it. But this one doesn't need to work for it. Some things simply cannot be taught. She kissed Viola's cheek while the room lifted their glasses. Two of her friends began applauding. My father studied the centerpiece. My aunt laughed at something the woman beside her whispered. Someone's phone screen tilted in my direction. Three of my mother's colleagues watched me with the careful expressions of people pretending not to watch. I was standing beneath a banner my mother had ordered that read "Congratulations, Nina," and I understood, with my whole body and not just my mind, that the banner had always been the afterthought. Have you ever been given credit and diminished in the same sentence? Have you ever watched someone hand you a gift with one hand while taking something larger with the other, and smiled because the room was watching and you had not yet learned that their comfort was not your responsibility? If you know what that feels like, this story is for you. And before I tell you what my sister's fiancé asked her, in front of 200 people, 11 years after that dinner, I want you to do something first. Tell me where you're watching from. What time is it where you are? I want to know how far this has traveled, because what happened matters, and I need someone to hear it all the way through. I left before the dessert course. I went home, counted the money I had saved in an envelope from 2 years of weekend shifts, and found $312. I placed my house key on the counter beside the graduation card my mother had signed without writing a message. I had already purchased a bus ticket 2 weeks earlier. Not out of certainty, but out of the quiet understanding that I might need one. I took 3 boxes of belongings and left. I told myself I was overreacting. That is what you tell yourself when the people who raised you have spent 22 years making that word feel like the truth about you. The bus from Cincinnati to Minneapolis took 16 hours. I had chosen Minneapolis because a professor had mentioned a credit union headquarters there that recruited recent graduates into compliance training, and I had researched the program during finals week, while my mother planned the guest list for the dinner. I arrived at 6 in the morning with $44 left after food and transit, found a YMCA with monthly room rentals, and sat on the edge of a narrow bed while the city woke up outside a window. I was not yet entirely sure I had the right to. The credit union hired me in my second week. The work was methodical, reviewing loan applications, cross-referencing authorization signatures, flagging irregularities in documentation before they became problems. My supervisors noticed that I did not rush through the detailed parts. They were usually where the errors lived, and I had grown up in a house that taught me to read the distance between what was said and what was actually meant. The woman in the cubicle across from mine was named Clem. She brought in bad gas station coffee every morning and drank it without apology. She did not ask why I had no family photographs on my desk. She asked what time I preferred for lunch so she could work around her schedule to match it. That was how she built things, through small, consistent choices that eventually added up to something you could trust. She was the first person I told about the graduation dinner, 9 months after it happened, and she listened to the whole thing before saying a single word. Then she said, "People who rewrite history count on everyone else losing the receipts." She said it while eating a sandwich. She did not know she was describing exactly what I had been afraid of without being able to name it. My family sent letters. The first arrived 3 months after I left, and explained at length how my absence had affected the family business. My mother ran a gift and home accessories shop in Kettering, Ohio, which my father managed the accounts for, and closed with an offer to return once I had sorted out my attitude. The second arrived at Christmas and mentioned that Viola had signed with a modeling agency in Columbus, and that everyone was very proud. The third, in my second year, claimed my father had undergone a cardiac procedure and that a loving daughter would come home. I called the hospital listed in the letter. He had had an outpatient procedure for an irregular heartbeat. He was discharged the same day. I kept the letters in a folder. I did not answer them, but I kept them because Clem had told me that people who bend the truth count on everyone else discarding the evidence, and I had felt that sentence land somewhere deep and permanent. In my fourth year at the firm, I was promoted to senior compliance analyst and began working on external audit referrals, small business lending reviews, fraud flags, documentation discrepancy reports. The work required me to spend long days comparing signatures, tracing authorization chains, identifying the quiet places where paperwork had been adjusted to say something different from what it originally meant. My mother had spent 22 years teaching me that appearance was the only currency that counted. My work taught me that appearance was exactly what forged documents relied on, and that evidence did not negotiate. I met Tobias at a municipal budget workshop that neither of us wanted to attend. He was a structural engineer from St. Paul who had been sent by his firm for reasons that remained bureaucratically unclear to him. We shared a table. He did not fill silence with small talk. He asked me one real question about my work, and then listened to the actual answer. On our third date, he accidentally ordered the wrong dish, and spent 6 minutes describing, with complete sincerity, what he had hoped it would taste like. I think that was when I understood that this was someone worth trusting. Specificity in disappointment is a form of honesty most people avoid. I told him about my family in pieces, not all at once. He never pressured me to move faster. He asked once, quietly, whether staying away brought me peace, or whether I was still deciding. I told him it depended on the week. He said that sounded honest. He left it there. 8.5 years after I left Kettering with $312, a small business lending file appeared on my desk as part of a routine fraud referral. The business address was in Kettering, Ohio. I assumed coincidence. The city had 40,000 residents and dozens of commercial storefronts. Then I read the business description: a gift and home accessories retailer with a secondary wholesale account. Then I read the authorized signatory list. My name was on it. Not my mother's name, not my father's name, my full legal name, Nina Aldred, listed as a co-borrower and guarantor on a business line of credit extended 7 years earlier. 7 years ago, I had been living in a studio apartment in South Minneapolis and had not spoken to my family in over a year. I disclosed the conflict to my supervisor and removed myself from the file. Then I went home and ordered my credit report. My mother had opened a retail credit account in my name 11 months after I left. She had managed the payments carefully enough that the account aged into something resembling an established credit history. Over 6 years, my name appeared on 3 equipment leases, a commercial loan co-application, and a supplier payment guarantee. Most accounts were paid and closed. One was still active. It secured a revolving line of credit with a current balance of $260,000. I spread the records across the kitchen table. Tobias sat beside me without speaking until I was ready. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I told him I needed to document everything before I did anything else. Confrontation gives people time to destroy records. Evidence gives you something that outlasts their explanation. I filed an identity theft report. I froze my credit. I hired an Ohio consumer protection attorney, and then I waited because the next move was not mine to make. 6 weeks later, my sister called. I had not heard Viola's voice in 8 years. She cried immediately. Not the slow kind of crying that builds honestly, but the strategic kind that arrives just before the ask. She said our mother was under pressure from a lender. She said there had been a miscommunication about the paperwork. She said all I needed to do was sign a short statement confirming that I had verbally authorized the use of my credit history for family purposes years ago when we were all closer. I asked who had first suggested using my name. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "You weren't using your credit for anything anyway." That sentence was the end of whatever I had still been holding on to without admitting it. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it was honest in the way that only true beliefs can be. She had told me exactly how my family thought about me. I was an unused resource, a shelf they had decided they were entitled to stock. Before I ended the call, she mentioned she was engaged. His name was Archer. He worked as a commercial lending officer at a bank in Columbus. The wedding was set for the following spring at a renovated historic inn 30 miles east of Kettering. Their mother was handling the costs. She hoped I would come. I reviewed the active credit line again that evening. Several large transactions had been made in the past 18 months to a hospitality vendor connected to the inn Viola had described. My mother had not saved enough money to fund a wedding. She had borrowed it, using my name, and planned to resolve the legal question after the ceremony was complete, once my signature could be obtained retroactively. I almost did not go. I want to be honest about that. I sat with the invitation for 2 weeks after it arrived and spent 3 separate evenings convincing myself it was not my responsibility to be in that building. I had built a life in Minneapolis. I had a job I was good at, a man who listened, and a friendship with Clem that had held through a decade of small, honest moments. I did not need to walk back into that family to prove anything. But my attorney explained the risk clearly. If I stayed away, my mother could use my absence to suggest I had tacitly withdrawn my dispute. And there was a part of me, smaller than the rest but real, that needed to be in the room when the truth arrived. Not to watch anyone fall, but to stop being the person my mother described when I was not there to say otherwise. I told Tobias I needed to go alone, not to protect him from my family, but because I needed to enter that building as myself. He understood. He did not push. The inn was everything the invitation implied: restored brick and September light, white flowers on every surface, guests in their best clothes moving through the lobby while a string quartet tuned in the adjoining hall. I arrived early and found a seat near the back. I watched my mother work the room. She saw me the moment I stepped through the entrance. Her expression shifted. Surprise, then the practiced warmth she used for difficult vendors. She crossed the floor and said, loudly enough for the guests nearby, "You actually came. My wandering daughter, finally home." I said I would not have missed it, and left it there. My father found me near the windows. He was thinner than I remembered, slower in the way people become when something has been quietly taken from them for years. He hugged me before I had decided whether to allow it. I stepped back. He said he was sorry. I asked what for. He looked toward my mother and said, "For how things went." The fact that he still could not name a specific thing told me everything I needed about what 11 years of silence had cost him, in a different way than it had cost me, but a cost nonetheless. My mother spent the cocktail hour introducing me to guests as her complicated daughter, the one who had needed space to find herself. She told one couple I had left after a teenage misunderstanding. She showed someone a high school photograph, braces, eyes half closed, and said with a soft laugh, "She never liked cameras, you can probably see why." The people around her laughed the way people laugh when they are not sure what else to do. I did not leave, I did not cry, I was not there to win the room. 40 minutes before the ceremony, I found a quiet corner near the inn's business library and spread my documents on a sideshock table to review the timeline. That was where my mother found me. She entered, closed the door, and dropped the warmth entirely. She said the investigation was timed deliberately to embarrass the family. She said what had happened with my credit was administrative convenience, that parents sometimes used family information when children were unreachable. I reminded her that I had been a legal adult living in another state and had never been asked. She produced a document from her handbag. I recognized the format immediately. It was a prepared statement declaring that I had given verbal authorization for all accounts bearing my name, and that any dispute arose from a misunderstanding of family financial customs. At the bottom was a line for my signature. She offered me $40,000 after a planned refinancing if I signed before the ceremony started. I said, "You invited me here to turn theft into consent." She told me not to use legal language about a family matter. When I moved toward the door, she reached for the folder in my hand. I held on. Inside it were the identity theft report, the disputed account summary, and the statement she had just tried to get me to sign. Unsigned, dated, and now part of the record. Viola entered moments later, still in her bridal robe, and locked the door behind her. She stood between me and the exit. "Just sign it," she said quietly. "The deposits are already spent. We can't get them back." I asked whether Archer knew the wedding was financed through a credit line guaranteed by my forged name. She looked at the floor. My father had followed and stood near the window. He confirmed that he had signed corporate resolutions supporting the loan applications. He said the business had been failing. He said employees had depended on them. He said my mother had first suggested using my credit file because mine was clean. I said, "So you used it because I wasn't there to say no?" No one answered. I walked out into the hall. Archer was standing 12 feet from the door. He was a composed man, the kind who read a room carefully before entering it. He had heard the last exchange through the door, and his expression was not alarmed. It was the controlled stillness of someone reorganizing what he thought he understood. The inn's event coordinator had informed him that the final transfer for the venue had been frozen due to an account flag. The name on the disputed transfer was mine. He asked whether I was Nina Aldred. I said yes. He asked whether I had authorized the account. I said no. He asked how long I had known. I told him I had filed an identity theft report months before receiving the wedding invitation. I showed him the report number and the disputed signature. My name, written in handwriting I had never produced, dated to a period when I had not spoken to my family in over a year. Then I showed him the statement my mother had tried to get me to sign less than 30 minutes earlier. He read it twice, then he looked up. "Does Viola know?" he asked. I told him to ask her. My mother arrived before he could move. She positioned herself between us and explained in a calm, practiced voice that this was a private financial matter being resolved by attorneys, that I had a documented history of misrepresenting family situations, and that the ceremony should begin immediately because guests were seated and the musicians were waiting. Archer said, "You're telling me the wedding was funded by a loan your daughter is actively disputing in court." My mother said I was exaggerating the timeline. He held up the prepared statement and asked why it had been written and carried to a wedding if the dispute was minor. Viola arrived in her gown. Her first question was, "Can the ceremony still go forward if we replace the transfer by Monday?" Archer looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the documents and walked toward the ballroom. The string quartet had begun the processional. Guests were turned toward the entrance, expecting the bridal party. Archer walked to the front of the room alone, asked the musicians to stop, and waited for the hall to quiet. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He stood in his wedding clothes before 200 people and spoke in a voice that was deliberate and exactly clear. "Viola," he said, "why is your sister's name on the loan documents that paid for this wedding? And why, when you learned that she had reported her signature was forged, did you not tell me?" The room went completely silent. Viola's bouquet lowered toward the floor. A guest near the center aisle repeated the word "forged" as a question to the person beside her. Viola said she had trusted that the paperwork would be resolved, that the money had already been committed, that she had believed it would work itself out before anyone needed to know. Archer asked whether working itself out meant that she intended to tell him after the wedding, once my signature had been secured to legalize the arrangements retroactively. She said that was not how she had thought about it. He said, "That's exactly how the documents describe it." My mother stepped forward and announced that I had staged this moment out of envy, that I had always resented Viola's happiness, that the real story was a difficult daughter leveraging a family financial disagreement to destroy the one day they had welcomed her back into the fold. I walked to the front of the room. I did not take the microphone. I told the guests 3 things. I had never authorized a single account bearing my name. I had filed an identity theft report months before receiving the wedding invitation. My mother had presented me with a prepared legal statement for my signature less than an hour ago, and I had refused to sign it. I held up the document. My father stepped forward. He confirmed, quietly, that he had witnessed loan applications prepared without my presence or knowledge. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. It did not absolve him, but it prevented my mother from claiming she was working from a different version of events. The consequences moved through the room in rings. A business associate of my father's stepped immediately outside to make a call. A supplier asked whether his own invoices had been used in similar applications. The event coordinator froze the venue account pending lender instruction. One of the groomsmen quietly told his wife they should find their car. Archer left with his parents. Before going, he stopped beside me and said he was sorry for what had been done with my name and that he wished the truth had found a different door. I told him truth that arrives at the last moment is still better than a life built on the story your family preferred. Viola sat alone in the bridal suite while her bridesmaids removed the floral arrangements and repacked gifts. She asked me to come in. I stood near the doorway. She worked through the blame methodically. Our mother first, then the lender, then Archer, then me. I waited until the list ran out. You knew my name was on those accounts, I said. You called me to ask me to sign something. That's when you had a choice. She said she had been afraid the wedding would disappear if she looked too closely at where the money came from. I told her I understood fear. I had left home with $312 and sat on the edge of a YMCA bed at 6 a.m. in a city I did not know, understanding exactly what it felt like to need something to be over so badly that you looked away from it. But fear was not the same as innocence, and she was not 20 years old. Neither of us was anymore. She asked whether I was happy now. The question told me she still understood me as someone who had been competing all along, waiting to trade places, wanting to watch her fall so I could stand in the space she left. That was the only story she had been given to understand me by. I'm not happy about any of this, I said. I'm free. Those aren't the same thing. My mother found me near the entrance as the last guests filtered out. She said I had destroyed a family that had given me everything. I told her she had used my name to borrow $260,000, while telling anyone who asked that I had chosen to disappear. That was not giving me everything. That was treating my absence as inventory. She called me ungrateful and cold, and said she had always known I would find a way to make my departure into something it was not. I told her the only tools I had used were the ones she had taught me to fear: documentation, dates, signatures. Evidence that did not change its account depending on who was listening. She called me plain, just like she had once told 39 people at a graduation dinner that my sister was the one who lit up rooms without effort. The words arrived differently this time, not smaller exactly, but older. Like hearing a recording of something that had once shaken the walls, playing now through a small speaker in a room that had already been cleared out. I picked up my bag and walked out. The legal outcome moved slowly, the way those things do. My mother cooperated partially with the lender's fraud review once it became clear that the documentation was comprehensive and that my attorney was not inclined to negotiate. She avoided criminal charges through cooperation and repayment arrangements tied to the sale of business assets. The shop in Kettering closed the following winter. She received financial monitoring, restitution requirements, and credit restrictions. She did not contact me once during the proceedings. I think she had finally understood what silence actually cost, not in terms of what it protected, but in terms of what it forfeited. My father submitted a written account to the fraud examiner. He lost his role in the business and spent several months in what he described, in a letter to me, as the quietest stretch of his life. He has sent cards since then, not on birthdays or holidays, but on dates that seem random until I understand they correspond to decisions he made years ago that he is still trying to name accurately. I read them. I have not responded to all of them. I am still deciding what I am waiting for. Viola called 14 months after the wedding that did not happen. She did not ask for anything. She said the first 3 months of therapy had consisted mostly of realizing how much of her identity had been built around being chosen by our mother, and how little that had actually protected her from her. She said she was sorry, not for a specific item, but for the accumulated weight of looking the other way, because looking directly would have cost her something she was not ready to pay. I told her an apology was a beginning, not a resolution. She said she knew. We have spoken 4 times since. The conversations are careful and honest, and nothing like the relationship I once imagined we might have had under different circumstances. I do not know what they will become. I am paying attention, which is more than I could have said 3 years ago. Tobias and I married the following spring in a small ceremony at a botanical garden with Clem and 7 friends. Nobody ranked the women in the room. Nobody used the occasion to repair a reputation before an audience. When the officiant asked whether I wanted to take Tobias's last name, I said no. Nina Aldred had been the name on the documents my mother forged because she believed my name belonged to her to use. Keeping it was my way of saying that something does not stop being yours because someone else decided to help themselves to it. I now run a compliance consulting practice working with financial institutions on internal fraud prevention. Last year, I created a small emergency fund through the credit union that first hired me. It provides $300 to staff and clients facing sudden transportation or housing gaps. Not because $300 solves a problem on its own, but I know what it can carry, paired with one honest opportunity and a bus ticket, when you have no other options and the last thing you want to do is go back to where you came from. People ask whether what happened at the inn was revenge. I understand why. A wedding was stopped. A business closed. My mother lost the standing she had spent 30 years constructing, but revenge would have required me to build the damage. I documented actions, refused to sign away the truth, and stayed in the room long enough, for the people my family had misled to make their own decisions with accurate information. My mother spent years believing that if she controlled the story, she controlled reality. She told 47 people at my graduation dinner that my sister was the one who did not have to work for what she had, and she believed those words would keep me reaching toward her approval for the rest of my life. Instead, they pushed me 3 states away with $312, a bus ticket, and an extremely good reason to learn how to read a forged document. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the conditions under which access to your life is granted. Accountability is not punishment simply because the person facing it shares your last name. And love, real love, does not require you to become invisible so that someone else can take up more space. For years I believed that leaving made me the daughter who broke the family. What the records eventually showed me was that I had only stopped being the person holding the cracks together, while everyone else pretended the cracks were not there. My mother's greatest loss was not the business or the wedding or the social standing she had carefully tended for decades. It was the story, the version in which she was the misunderstood mother, abandoned by a cold and ungrateful daughter who left for no real reason. She had told that story to clients, neighbors, relatives, anyone who would hold still long enough. She had told it so many times that she had begun to depend on it the way people depend on explanations they have never had to defend with evidence. The problem with building your identity on a version of events is that documentation does not care how many times you have told it. And neither, in the end, did I.